vine weed and it interferes. He says, we were sterile. We didn't have all those vine weeds and all that. It was easy to grow corn. But the other thing is that as money became more valuable, my grandfather grew the best corn around, and he used to make the best corn whiskey. So he would actually make a lot of moonshine, and my grandfather had his still in a place, and my dad tells me about those days where his dad was doing that just to make that extra cash. Well, the one thing I remember about my grandmother and my grandfather, they dressed well. My grandfather had a real nice beaver hat. He had a Stetson. It was top of the line. He had a nice suit, and he had just really dressed. When they went to town, they dressed well. They didn't leave the ranch without a piece of cloth in place. Everything was in order. Well, my dad tells me that his brother got caught by the federal officers, and he went to prison for a year. And the reason why is a lot of this moonshine was tied to the mafia back in the East. And one of his competitors was jealous of their operation and turned him in, and that's how they got busted. But my grandfather never took it out on the guy that he knew had turned him in. The people from the East Coast actually took care of that. And so my grandfather, though, when he was arrested, he gave a barrel of whiskey to the judge and he was let go. But he never went back into that trade. He did things differently. But it just lets you know, these are all the stories of survival. Now, a lot of people didn't survive. It was hard for them to survive. And so a lot of them migrated. And my dad was the youngest of his family of 8. And he remembers going with his aunt and uncles up to Colorado. And he was a migrant worker. But because he was the youngest, he didn't have to pick like his brothers and sisters were picking. But the people, the farmers that he was picking for, they would take him along to take all the stuff to the silage, all the corn and stuff like that. And he would travel up with them, and he did help some, but he said, he was so young that he wasn't a good help. But he remembers all of this money was used for school clothes. It was used for necessities for the whole year. So he remembers those times. And he later on learned how to frame houses from his brother that taught him, and they were working out in Colorado doing framing. And so one of the sites, one of the affordable housing complexes, he worked all summer framing the frames for those houses. And later on, I became the housing director and actually had it demolished. So I told him, it was just something that we have stories about. But, my dad tells about all these stories. Now, I have to write them down. I have to restore them because I'm going to have to pass them on to my grandkids who are curious about where they came from. And so I went and had my family tree done. I went and had stories of my grandfather written down. And he tells me about his brothers and sisters, stories that even their kids don't know about. And so we passed it on. Most of his family worked up at the parachute factory here. Mm-hmm. And so we do have photos of the parachute factory, and we have relatives that work there. They were able to make their fortunes with the parachute factory because, one, I had an aunt that was a very good seamstress. And she was able to make extra money if she did so many seams of parachute, they would get paid extra. And she was just really good with her hands, and she was able to do parachutes, and she would put money away. Well, they bought a lot of their land that way. And so my aunt was able to accumulate several thousand acres by working with the parachute factory. And of course, her kids now, before she passed, I remember that we were sitting at the kitchen table and she was teaching me when I was probably 6 or 7 how to make a wreath, a Christmas wreath. And so we would go up and cut Christmas trees, and back then they were selling for $1.50 a Christmas tree, and we were cutting, and we would do 100 Christmas trees, and they thought that was a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Well, my dad worked with some people from Texas and was able to get them up to $225, and so I really liked doing the wreaths. I didn't like so much climbing the mountain because they would send us young. They would send it up at the top, and we would cut the tree and topple it down so it would hit on the end. So the younger ones would go up and do that, and that's what we were for. But you know, I remember in my 40s climbing a tree and topping it down. You know, but I've always done wreaths every year. Now my cousins still were doing wreaths, and they had a ranch up in Gascon. And with this past fire, they lost all their forests. Mm-hmm. So they were making probably 10,000 wreath orders a year. That's how it had grown. And they had a bunch of people hired that would help them make the wreaths on the machines. And then they would send out their truckloads to Texas. Well, guess what? They were just impacted by this fire. 2 years ago, I was in Albuquerque and we sold 600 trees at our Christmas tree lot. Imagine that, let's just say we averaged $50 a tree. That's what we made extra for ourselves, just income for the year. I remember that year we made about $7,000 extra just in trees, and that's including wreaths and stuff like that. So, you know, it was just devastating because now they're having to search for places that they might have to buy their rama from those people, and it'll impact their income. And you know, my dad always told us, don't rely on that, rely on education. So my dad, he was the first one in his family to get a degree. And he got a degree in chemistry and physics, and he got his master's degree at Highlands. And you know, one of the things that he always emphasizes is that you go get your degree. And I remember that I was wanting, you know, I went to West Las Vegas and I played sports, and I didn't think that I was that smart. You know, I was a C student, wasn't that smart. So I wasn't really wanting to go to college. I was afraid. So I chose to go into the military. I went into the Navy, and I went through 4 years of the Navy and came back, and I put money away so I could go to college. And I came back to Highlands, got my history degree, and I found out college isn't that hard. If you just focus on reading, focus on going to class, you know, that's the 2 key things. And if you do that, you get your degree. So I had a high 3.4 GPA, and later on I went and got my master's, and so I tell my kids, you know, if you're going to be have things that you love to do, but also make sure that you go off and get your degree. Well, my dad always emphasized that, so that's something that was passed down to me. And he says, don't rely on the land because it's not always going to be there. And he sort of predicted this fire, because months before, he says, there might be a fire, let's start cutting. And we were cutting and weeding and thinning, and I mean, I took out of there 20 cords of wood, and I had on the ground about another 20. And then the fire came. And so this year, I wasn't able to give the wood or sell the wood that I had. I had to So that date, the fire came on April 22nd. And my dad had us working since probably February thinning. He just had a feeling it was dry, it was abnormally dry up there, and there was a lot of extra weeds because it had rained a lot the year before. So he had us really cutting a lot. And so April 22nd come, I had just spent all day wetting my house, the surrounding area, and the fire came. And I remember my dad was doing the same. He was wetting his house with water. And we had been weed eating all the grass around as far as we could away from the house. And then the fire came, and I remember that night, it all of a sudden was about 6:30 in the evening. It didn't get dark till 8:15, and it went dark. It started to go dark. So I drove my truck and trailer, loaded my horses, my dog, and I wet the pig pen full of water so that there was a big pond in there, and we were leaving. And Dr. Brainerd, my dad, and my brother were there, and they said, we better get out of here. So we took off, and then all of a sudden these pine cones started flying down, and they were on flame, like always coming out, hitting all around. And we were just freaking out how dark it was, and the heat just went up tremendously, and we got out of there. We came back a day later. My brother came back a day later. I came 2 days later, and there was still fire. And so we were out putting neighbors' fire out. And this, to me, was another historical event that we needed to record. So this organization did a lot of photographs, asked people to send their photographs of their fires that they had all over the area. And we didn't realize what an impact it would be. And also, we didn't realize how traumatized we were. We started to realize how traumatized we were about half a year later. We started to realize how traumatized we were. And I think because we never stopped trying to thin and do those things, we're still doing that. I spent the whole day yesterday doing again, thinning, cutting grass as far. I didn't want anything big because right now it was dry, and then it started raining. So now we have to worry about the floods, and we got mud everywhere. My dad spent probably a week and a half just moving mud with a tractor. So he was working 8 hours a day with a tractor, moving mud, bucket after bucket after bucket. And then he had a 15,000-gallon pond that he had that was full of mud. And I said, Dad, do you want help with that? And he did it by hand. Each shovel, every shovel, moving that whole pond of mud out. And he just said, I have to do this. I have to do this, you know. And, you know, I remember him sitting, we took a photo of him sitting in the middle of a burnt forest that was his, and he was saying, I will not see this back in my lifetime, you know, and he says, you will probably not see it back in your lifetime. And so he started to talk about what we needed to do to restore our forest. So right now he has a plan where we're gonna go cut anything that's burnt down and start looking at restoring the property. And so, but in his mind, he knows that it's not going to be what it once was. I actually took him to where he was born, and it was completely burned. And we took photos of that, and the emotional outburst, you know, you could see that he was hurting inside about that. And he says, you know, we did everything here by hand.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to speak about? Because you took us to the fires that kind of brought us current.
Yeah. I just want to end with one other thing. Just one other thing. I'm just going to sort of bring it back to where we're at and what we're doing with what I see happening for.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I like this place. I find it peaceful.
Well, you know, we tell people they can come here anytime. We have people that have meetings here. Even some of the councilmen will ask me, can I meet with a constituent here? I says, do you want privacy? She says, total. And I says, okay, come in. And so I'll let him in, I'll lock him in, and I just say,
Okay,
just lock
let's
it under
start
out.
from the top. That was, we could use it in.
Yeah.
Okay, so,
Just wherever you guys want to start.
Yeah. So you want to bring it back to?
I want to bring it back to where we are today. You know, for myself, I volunteered here, and I know that it's so important that there's two things that we try to do. Is we're not here to take anything for us. We're here to give to anyone that has questions about their heritage. And the thing is, we try to, this Places with the Past tour, we've included Mora for the first year. This year we had our awards banquet, which included 3 homes from Mora. And now we're doing the Places with the Past tour, which is looking at buildings that are historical in nature. And this year we're including Mora again. And I think it's important because during the fire, one thing that this town learned was we had people talking about the workforce. You know, Walmart closed because they didn't have enough employees. The government was saying, we want our workers back to the workforce, stop focusing on whatever you're doing and come back to work so that we can make sure that we have our stores open. Needless to say, 518 was closed. And we don't realize how many people from Mora work here. They're half our workforce. And so when they're not here, we don't have our workforce. And so that's how tightly knit we are. And then of course, a lot of us are married to people from Mora, or we have family in Mora. And you know, they're just part of this community. So, you know, one of the mission statements we have is the city of Las Vegas and the surrounding area, you know. And the fact is, they're part of us. And so we're including them for the first time. And the excitement that I get from them is that they want to share their history too. And so that's what we're doing here, is we're sharing the history with Mora. And so the 3 mills are going to be shown this year as part of that. The Rural College, the 3 mills, and they're all just as important. You know, the mills were the food, the breadbasket of this area when the Santa Fe Trail was coming in, and it's always been that way. Those mills produced a lot of flour that was a necessity for us to make tortillas and different things. But that's where we're at. We're at expanding our heritage to the surrounding communities and doing those type of things. And I think that that's where I want to just end it, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good job.